Churchill becomes Prime Minister. On the 10th of May, 1940, as German forces swept across Western Europe in a devastating offensive, Britain found herself at a crossroads. The nation required a leader of iron will and unwavering resolve. On that fateful morning, Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill, at the age of 65, was summoned to Buckingham Palace by King George VI. He would emerge as Prime Minister, the man destined to guide Britain through her darkest hour. Yet the path that led Churchill to number 10 Downing Street was neither straight nor certain. It was forged through decades of military service, political triumph, devastating failure, and years of isolation in the political wilderness. His was a life shaped by war, and it would be war that finally called him to his greatest purpose. Early life and family background. Winston Leonard Spencer Churchill was born on the 30th of November, 1874, at Blenheim Palace, Blenheim in Oxfordshire, the ancestral seat of the Dukes of Marlborough. He was a direct descendant of John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, whose victories against France in the early 18th century had secured Britain's place among the great powers of Europe. His father, Lord Randolph Henry Spencer Churchill, was a prominent conservative statesman who had served as both Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons. His mother, Jenny Jerome, was the beautiful and talented daughter of Leonard Jerome, a wealthy American businessman from New York. This Anglo-American heritage would later prove significant, for Churchill understood both worlds intimately. Young Winston's childhood was marked by the distant formality typical of the Victorian aristocracy. His parents, consumed by their own social and political pursuits, left much of his upbringing to his devoted nanny, Elizabeth Ann Everest, whom he affectionately called Wom. She provided the warmth and stability that his parents could not. Churchill struggled academically during his early years at St. George's School in Ascot and later at Brunswick School in Hove. However, his fortunes improved when he entered Harrow School in April 1888. It was here that his interest in military affairs became apparent, and his father determined that a military career would suit him best. After 3 attempts, Churchill secured admission to the Royal Military College at Sandhurst. He applied himself with newfound dedication, graduating 20th out of 130 cadets in December 1894. His father passed away just weeks later, in January 1895, at the age of 45. Military service and early adventures. In February 1895, Churchill was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the 4th Queen's Own Hussars stationed at Aldershot. He was eager to see action, to test himself under fire. His first taste of combat came in Cuba in November 1895, where he served as an observer with the Spanish army during their conflict against Cuban rebels. He came under fire shortly after his 21st birthday and was decorated with the Spanish Order of Military Merit for distinguished conduct under fire. Churchill next saw service on the northwest frontier of India in 1897, attached to the Malakand Field Force. He participated in fierce fighting against Pashtun tribesmen and was mentioned in dispatches. His accounts of the campaign became his first book, The Story of the Malakand Field Force, published in 1898. In the summer of 1898, Churchill used every connection available to secure a position with General Sir Herbert Kitchener's campaign in the Sudan. Despite Kitchener's personal objections, Churchill joined the 21st Lancers as a subaltern, while simultaneously serving as a war correspondent for the Morning Post. On the 2nd of September, 1898, at the Battle of Omdurman, Churchill participated in one of the British Army's last great cavalry charges. Having injured his sword hand beforehand, he armed himself with a Mauser pistol. During the charge, he became separated from his regiment and was surrounded by enemy fighters. He shot dead at least 3 adversaries at close range and narrowly escaped with his life. His subsequent 2-volume history, The River War, chronicled the campaign and was notably critical of Kitchener's conduct. Churchill resigned his army commission in the spring of 1899, determined to pursue a career in politics. He stood for Parliament as a Conservative candidate at Oldham in June 1899, but lost by a narrow margin. The Boer War and Fame. The outbreak of the Second Boer War in October 1899 presented Churchill with another opportunity for adventure. He travelled to South Africa as a war correspondent for the Morning Post, which offered him the substantial sum of £1,000 for the first 4 months. On the 15th of November, 1899, 2 weeks after his arrival, Churchill was aboard an armoured train near Chieveley when it was ambushed by Boer artillery. Despite being a civilian correspondent, Churchill rallied the soldiers, helped clear the track, and organized the defense. He was captured and imprisoned in a prisoner of war camp in Pretoria. Churchill made a formal protest regarding his civilian status, but the Boers noted that he had been carrying a revolver during his capture. In December, he made a daring escape, scaling the latrine wall and evading capture by hiding in mines and stowing away aboard freight trains. After 9 days traveling nearly 300 miles through enemy territory, he reached safety in Portuguese East Africa, present-day Mozambique. His escape made him a national hero. Churchill briefly rejoined the army as a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse Regiment, participating in the relief of Ladysmith and the capture of Pretoria. He was among the first British troops to enter both cities. His dispatches were published as London to Ladysmith via Pretoria and sold remarkably well. Entry into politics and marriage. In October 1900, Churchill was elected to Parliament as Conservative member for Oldham. He was 25 years old. His maiden speech in February 1901 gained widespread press coverage. Churchill grew increasingly dissatisfied with the Conservative position on free trade. In May 1904, he crossed the floor of the House of Commons and joined the Liberal Party, a move that earned him lasting enemies among Conservatives. When the Liberals won their landslide victory in January 1906, Churchill was appointed Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies. He rose rapidly through the Liberal ranks, becoming President of the Board of Trade in 1908 and Home Secretary in 1910. On the 12th of September, 1908, Churchill married Clementine Ogilvie Hosier at St. Margaret's Church, Westminster. She was 23 years old to his 33. The wedding was the social event of the season, with over 1,000 guests in attendance. Their marriage, which would endure for 56 years, produced 5 children. Diana, born in 1909, Randolph, born in 1911, Sarah, born in 1914, Marigold, born in 1918, and Mary, born in 1922. Tragically, Marigold died of septicemia at the age of 2 in 1921. Clementine would prove to be Churchill's closest confidant and steadfast supporter throughout his tumultuous political career. He later wrote that marrying her was the most fortunate and joyous event of his entire life. First Lord of the Admiralty and the Great War. In 1911, Churchill was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty, responsible for the Royal Navy's readiness. He threw himself into the role with characteristic energy, modernizing the fleet, championing naval aviation, and preparing Britain's naval forces for the conflict he foresaw approaching. When the Great War erupted in August 1914, Churchill was instrumental in mobilizing the Royal Navy. However, his tenure at the Admiralty became forever associated with one of the war's greatest disasters. In late 1914, Churchill proposed a naval assault on the Dardanelles Straits to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war and open a supply route to Russia. Despite warnings about mines and shore defenses, Churchill pressed for action. The initial naval bombardment began on the 19th of February, 1915. The naval attack failed. When it became clear that ships alone could not force the straits, a land invasion was launched on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April, 1915. What was meant to be a swift victory descended into bloody stalemate. The campaign would cost over 250,000 Allied casualties before evacuation in January 1916. Churchill was not solely responsible for Gallipoli. The plan had been approved by the War Council, and failures of command and supply lay with many others. Nevertheless, he became the principal scapegoat. In May 1915, when Prime Minister Herbert Asquith formed a coalition government, the Conservatives demanded Churchill's removal from the Admiralty. Devastated, Churchill wrote to a friend that he was finished, yet he refused to accept defeat. In November 1915, he resigned from the government entirely and volunteered for active service on the Western Front, the trenches, and returned to government. Churchill was temporarily promoted to Lieutenant Colonel and given command of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. For 3 months, he led his men through the miseries of trench warfare near Ploegsteert in Belgium. He narrowly escaped death when a large piece of shrapnel fell between himself and his cousin, the Duke of Marlborough. In May 1916, when his battalion was merged into another unit, Churchill returned to politics. In July 1917, Prime Minister David Lloyd George appointed him Minister of Munitions, a position he held until January 1919. He subsequently served as Secretary of State for War and Air and later as Secretary of State for the Colonies. However, the interwar years proved difficult. Churchill's decision to return Britain to the gold standard as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1925 depressed the economy and damaged his reputation. His fierce opposition to Indian self-government in the early 1930s alienated him from conservative leadership. The wilderness years. By the early 1930s, Churchill found himself in the political wilderness, holding no government position and regarded by many as a relic of a bygone era. He retired to Chartwell, his beloved country home in Kent, where he wrote prolifically, including the 4-volume biography of his ancestor Marlborough. Yet Churchill was not silent. From 1933 onwards, he became the foremost voice warning of the danger posed by Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime. He spoke repeatedly in Parliament about German rearmament and the folly of British disarmament. In November 1934, he delivered a radio broadcast warning of Nazi intentions, the first time his concerns reached such a wide audience. Armed with intelligence provided secretly by sympathetic civil servants, he spoke with authority about the development of the German Air Force. His warnings fell largely on deaf ears. The government pursued appeasement, seeking to avoid war through concessions. In September 1938, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain signed the Munich Agreement, ceding part of Czechoslovakia to Germany in exchange for Hitler's promise of peace. Churchill was scathing. He declared in the House of Commons that Britain had suffered an unmitigated disaster and warned that this was not the end but only the beginning. He predicted that when the day came to make a stand, Britain might find through unwise policy that she had to make that stand alone. When German forces occupied the remainder of Czechoslovakia in March 1939, Churchill's prophecies were vindicated, yet still he remained outside government. The path to power. On the 1st of September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. 2 days later, Britain declared war. That same day, Chamberlain brought Churchill back into government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the same position he had held at the start of the Great War. The signal went out to the fleet, Winston is back. The first months of war, the so-called phony war, saw little action on land. But at sea, the Royal Navy was engaged from the outset. Churchill threw himself into the work with tremendous energy, though his involvement in the disastrous Norwegian campaign of April 1940 raised uncomfortable echoes of Gallipoli. The failure in Norway destroyed confidence in Chamberlain's leadership. On the 7th and 8th of May 1940, the House of Commons debated the campaign. Conservative members turned against their own Prime Minister. Chamberlain won the vote but lost his authority. On the evening of the 9th of May, Chamberlain met with Churchill and Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, to discuss the succession. Halifax, the preferred choice of both the King and the Conservative establishment, declined, believing he could not effectively lead from the House of Lords during wartime. The path was clear. On the morning of the 10th of May, 1940, German forces invaded Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. That afternoon, Chamberlain resigned. King George VI summoned Churchill to Buckingham Palace and asked him to form a government. Churchill later recalled that he felt as if he were walking with destiny and that all his past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial. He went to bed that night, he wrote, with a profound sense of relief. At last he had the authority to give direction over the whole scene. Wartime leadership. Churchill formed a coalition government with the Labour, Liberal and Conservative parties. He also created for himself the position of Minister of Defence, enabling him to work directly with his military commanders. He was determined not to repeat the confusion that had contributed to Gallipoli. The situation was desperate. Within weeks, the British Expeditionary Force was trapped at Dunkirk and France was falling. Between the 26th of May and the 4th of June, over 330,000 Allied troops were evacuated from the beaches in Operation Dynamo. On the 4th of June, Churchill addressed the House of Commons in what would become one of history's most famous speeches. He acknowledged the colossal military disaster that had occurred whilst defying those who counselled negotiation with Hitler. Britain, he declared, would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets. Britain would never surrender. On the 18th of June, following France's request for an armistice, Churchill delivered another immortal address. The Battle of France, he proclaimed, was over. The Battle of Britain was about to begin. Upon this battle depended the survival of Christian civilization. He concluded with words that still echo through history. If the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will say, this was their finest hour. Through the summer of 1940, the Royal Air Force fought the German Luftwaffe for control of the skies. On the 20th of August, Churchill paid tribute to the pilots in another memorable phrase, never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. When the Blitz began in September 1940, with London and other cities subjected to relentless bombing, Churchill toured the devastated areas, his presence and defiance lifting the spirits of his countrymen. His bulldog determination became the symbol of British resistance. Churchill worked 18-hour days, conducted business from his bed, and drove his staff relentlessly. He could be charming and generous, but also rude and demanding. Yet he drove himself harder than anyone else. His cultivation of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was crucial to Britain's survival. American aid, culminating in the Lend-Lease Agreement of March 1941, provided vital supplies. When Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941, bringing America into the war, Churchill knew ultimate victory was assured. Post-war and later years. By May 1945, Nazi Germany was defeated. Churchill was at the height of his prestige, with approval ratings of 83%. Yet in the general election held on the 5th of July, 1945, the British people delivered a stunning verdict. The Labour Party won a landslide victory with 393 seats against the Conservatives' 197. By May 1945, Nazi Germany was defeated. Churchill was at the height of his prestige, with approval ratings of 83%. Yet in the general election held on the 5th of July, 1945, the British people delivered a stunning verdict. The Labour Party won a landslide victory with 393 seats against the Conservatives' 197. In March 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he delivered his famous Iron Curtain speech, warning of Soviet expansion across Eastern Europe. His words helped define the emerging Cold War. Churchill continued writing, producing his 6-volume history of the Second World War and, later, his 4-volume history of the English-speaking peoples. In 1953, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for his mastery of historical and biographical description and for his brilliant oratory. That same year, Queen Elizabeth II invested him with the Order of the Garter, bestowing upon him a knighthood. In October 1951, Churchill returned to Downing Street after the Conservatives narrowly won the general election. At 77, he was too frail to govern with his former vigour. His second term focused largely on international relations and maintaining the post-war consensus at home. In April 1955, Churchill resigned as Prime Minister, though he remained a Member of Parliament until 1964. His health declined steadily in his final years, troubled by a series of strokes. Death and legacy. On the 15th of January, 1965, Winston Churchill suffered a severe stroke from which he never recovered. He died peacefully at his London home on the morning of the 24th of January, 1965, at the age of 90. It was exactly 70 years to the day after his father's passing. By decree of Queen Elizabeth II, Churchill was given a state funeral, the first for a non-royal commoner since the Duke of Wellington's funeral more than a century earlier. His body lay in state in Westminster Hall for 3 days, where more than 300,000 mourners filed past. On the 30th of January, the funeral service was held at St. Paul's Cathedral. Representatives from over 110 nations attended. Crowds estimated at over 1 million lined the route. 350 million people watched on television worldwide. Following the service, Churchill's coffin was borne by barge along the River Thames as the cranes of the London docks dipped in salute. A special train then carried him to his final resting place at St. Martin's Church in Bladon, near his birthplace at Blenheim Palace. He lies beside his parents and within sight of where he was born. Winston Churchill remains one of the most significant figures of the 20th century. In 2002, he was voted the greatest Briton of all time in a BBC poll. Historians consistently rank him among the greatest of British prime ministers. He was a man of profound contradictions, an aristocrat who championed social reform, a Victorian imperialist who shaped the modern world, a warrior who yearned for peace. He could be petty and magnanimous, reckless and far-sighted. infuriating and inspiring. Above all, in 1940, when Britain stood alone against tyranny, Winston Churchill provided the voice, the vision, and the will that refused to accept defeat. For that, his place in history is secure. His own words, spoken to the House of Commons on the 13th of May, 1940, serve as both his promise and his epitaph. "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." And in the end, that was enough.